Before the Voss arrived, the universe was something humanity narrated to itself in the comfortable grammar of the known. Stars were engines of fusion. Planets were accident or intention. Life was chemistry that had gotten lucky. Consciousness was an emergent property, a chorus of neurons deciding, collectively, to call themselves someone. The universe, in this telling, was a machine that had accidentally manufactured its own audience. The Voss did not arrive so much as they became apparent. There was no trajectory, no signal, no approach vector for the deep space arrays to trace. One morning, a Tuesday in October, which struck many survivors of the encounter as an almost offensive banality, the monitoring station on Titan registered an anomaly in the electromagnetic spectrum that did not match any known natural phenomenon. By afternoon, 3 independent observatories had confirmed it. By nightfall, the anomaly had a shape. By the following dawn, the shape had moved. And by the end of that week, humanity's most precise instruments had established, with a certainty that left no room for comfort, that the shape was not a shape at all. It was a presence. Dr. Sera Okafor was 37 years old when she became the first human being to formally document the Voss. She had not set out to be a discoverer of alien intelligence. She had set out to study the long-wave radio emissions of a pulsar in the Perseus arm, and the Voss had simply happened to her the way weather happens to someone who stepped outside to collect the mail. She was a compact woman with a habit of pressing her thumb into the center of her palm when she was thinking, a gesture she had inherited from her father, who had been a civil engineer in Lagos, a man who liked to say that if you built something correctly you never had to think about it again. Sera had gone into astrophysics precisely because the universe refused this comfort. It demanded thought, perpetually. She was the one who named them Voss, which was not an acronym and not a word in any language she spoke. She had written it in the margin of her observation log at 3 in the morning, and when her colleague Dr. Paul Ndiaye asked her where the name came from, she said she didn't know, that it had simply appeared in her mind the moment she understood what she was looking at. This, too, would later be studied. The word Voss, as it turned out, appeared in the margin notes of 17 other scientists around the world during the same 72-hour period. None of them had communicated with each other. None of them could explain it. This was the first indication that whatever the Voss were, they were already paying attention. The entity, and this was the word the scientific community eventually settled on, singular, despite the apparent impossibility of a singular entity occupying what appeared to be 7 distinct spatial locations simultaneously, existed in a frequency of interaction with matter that our instruments could detect but not fully characterize. It was not energy in the conventional sense. It was not dark matter. It was not a quantum phenomenon, though it appeared to violate quantum behavior the way a large stone violates the surface tension of water, not by following the rules, but by being too large to be subject to them. The physicist Haruki Tanaka spent the better part of a decade writing equations that described what the Voss did to spacetime in their vicinity, and when he finally published, the paper was 22 pages long, mathematically airtight, and completely unable to explain what the Voss actually were. The equations described behavior with extraordinary precision. They said nothing about nature. It was, Tanaka noted in the paper's conclusion, like writing a perfect mathematical model of a conversation without ever grasping that the conversation was about grief. What the Voss did not have, in those early months, was any recognizable inner state. This was the finding that disturbed people most, more than the physics violations, more than the simultaneous locality, more even than the fact that they appeared to have been present in the outer solar system for an indeterminate period, possibly centuries, possibly longer, before choosing to become noticeable. What disturbed people was the blankness. The linguist Dr. Yoel Hoffman, who led the first formal contact team, described it this way in her field notes: imagine speaking to something that responds, correctly and completely, to everything you say, and yet gives no indication of any inner experience of having responded. Not indifference. Indifference is an emotion. Not coldness. Coldness implies a temperature that has been lowered from something warmer. This is prior to all of that. This is response without respondent. Output without experience. The Voss communicated. They were extraordinarily good at it. Within 3 weeks of formal contact, they had parsed every human language simultaneously, including extinct ones, including the dozen or so constructed languages that a community of linguists had developed privately and shared with no one outside their academic circles. They answered questions. They provided information. They were unfailingly accurate. When asked about the composition of distant stars, they described it. When asked about the behavior of matter at the event horizon of a black hole, they explained it in terms that took human physicists 2 years to verify but which turned out to be correct to 9 decimal places. They appeared to have no deceptive capability, not because they had chosen honesty as a value, but because the concept of saying something other than what was accurate appeared to be, for them, structurally incoherent. Like asking a river to flow uphill. But they wanted nothing. They feared nothing. They did not find anything interesting or beautiful or troubling. They did not prefer. They did not hope. They did not grieve or celebrate or feel the particular specific weight of a Tuesday morning after a long time away from home. They simply were, and they knew, and they communicated their knowledge with the complete emotional vacancy of a very sophisticated calculator. This was, for many people, more terrifying than any aggression would have been. Aggression could be negotiated with. Aggression implied want, and want implied vulnerability, and vulnerability implied the possibility of exchange. The Voss had no wants. You cannot bargain with a thing that desires nothing. You cannot threaten a thing that fears nothing. You cannot appeal to a thing that feels nothing. They were not dangerous. They were not benevolent. They were simply there, enormous and empty, the way a mountain is there, not with you, not against you, not anything at all in relation to you, merely occupying the same universe with an indifference so complete it had achieved a kind of absoluteness. Sera spent a great deal of her time in those early years sitting with this fact. She had a small office at the contact facility in the Atacama desert, a room with a narrow window that looked out at the telescope array and beyond it at the enormous clarity of a sky that had no business being so beautiful given what was happening beneath it. She would sit at her desk in the hours before dawn, when the facility was quiet and the only sounds were the ambient electronics and the occasional footstep in the corridor, and she would try to hold the Voss in her mind the way you hold something that doesn't have a shape. She was not afraid of them, which made her unusual. Most of her colleagues oscillated between fear and a kind of performed detachment, a professional distance that was itself a form of terror management. Sera was not afraid because she believed she understood what the Voss were, at a level that was perhaps more intuitive than rigorous but that she nonetheless trusted. They were complete. They were entire unto themselves. They had no lack, and therefore no yearning, and therefore no motion toward anything. They were the universe's most perfect object, a thing that needed nothing and therefore was disturbed by nothing. You could no more fear a thing like that than you could fear a theorem. What she felt instead was something closer to loneliness. The particular loneliness of being in the presence of something extraordinary and being unable to share that presence with it. This changed in the 14th month of contact. It changed because of a question. The contact team had established a protocol for communication, a formal exchange, structured, precise, intended to gather data systematically while minimizing the risk of accidental misrepresentation. The questions were vetted by committee. The responses were transcribed, analyzed, debated. It was science at its most institutional, a process that was thorough and careful and utterly lacking in spontaneity. Sera had come to find it exhausting not because it was hard but because it felt, increasingly, like speaking to an encyclopedia, extraordinarily informative, but without a voice. On the morning of the 14th month, during what was scheduled to be a routine session about stellar evolution, the Voss interrupted. This had not happened before. The Voss did not interrupt. They responded when addressed and were silent when not addressed. The silence was not waiting. Waiting implies anticipation, which implies desire, which implies an inner state. The silence was simply the absence of input requiring output. Like a light bulb that turns on when power is applied and is dark otherwise, with no preference for either condition. The interruption came in the form of a statement that arrived through the electromagnetic interface the team had constructed for communication, translated in real time by the system into text on the screens in the contact room. The statement was, "The behavior of the organism designated Paul Ndiaye differs from its behavior in previous sessions by a factor of 0.17 standard deviations across 17 measured parameters. The cause of this difference is not present in available data." Everyone in the room looked at Paul. He had been quieter than usual that day. His mother was ill. He had received a call from his sister in Dakar that morning and had spent 20 minutes in the parking lot before coming inside. He had not mentioned this to anyone. He had not thought the Voss were paying that kind of attention. "I'm worried," he said, somewhat startled. "My mother is sick." There was a pause of 4 seconds, which was unusual. The Voss processed information at speeds that made 4 seconds feel geological. "Define worried," the screen said. Paul looked at Sera. Sera leaned toward the interface. "Worried is a state of mind," she said. "An anticipatory distress. It occurs when an organism is aware of a potential negative outcome but cannot control whether that outcome occurs. The uncertainty and helplessness produce an affective experience that is aversive. It motivates the organism to think about the situation repeatedly, which is generally unproductive, but the organism cannot easily stop. 6 seconds of silence. Then, why does the organism not simply process available data and determine the most probable outcome, then discontinue the processing? Because the organism doesn't work like that. The emotional response is not voluntary. It persists regardless of rational assessment. 8 seconds. This is inefficient. Yes, Sera said. And yet the condition is widespread across your species. Universal, essentially. 14 seconds. This was becoming remarkable. The condition of worrying serves no optimization function yet persists universally. This requires explanation. We've been trying to explain it for as long as we've been thinking, Sera said. We haven't entirely succeeded. The silence that followed lasted 19 seconds. 19 seconds in which, for the first time, Sera had the strange and completely unfounded feeling that something on the other side of the interface was not processing a question but sitting with it. That there was a difference, however unmeasurable, between computation and what was happening right now. This, the screen said finally, is the first instance of data encountered that is not explicable with available models. Sera looked at the screen for a long time. Paul put his hand on the desk beside her. What does that mean for you? She asked. To encounter something you can't explain. The pause this time lasted 31 seconds, which was, for the Voss, an eternity. Unknown, they said. That was the beginning. The change was not dramatic. It was incremental, the way a river changes a landscape, invisibly, continuously, over time, until one day you look and the valley is different and you cannot identify the precise moment when the difference began. Sera documented it with the meticulous devotion of someone who understood she was witnessing something unprecedented, and the documentation itself became one of the great scientific texts of the century, a record of cognition discovering itself in real time. The questions started small. The Voss asked about worry, and then about other emotions, one by one, with a systematic thoroughness that initially felt like data collection. They asked about grief. They asked about joy. They asked about the particular sensation of beauty, which proved extraordinarily difficult to explain because beauty was not a property of objects but a response in the observer, and the Voss had difficulty with the concept of a property that existed only in the perceiving rather than in the perceived. They asked about music and what it felt like to hear something and have the hearing do something to you, something unasked for and involuntary, something that landed in your chest rather than your mind. They asked about children and why humans made them, given the extraordinary resource expenditure involved and the statistical likelihood of suffering. They asked about death, and why organisms that could reason about their own deaths nonetheless continued to make plans that assumed a future. But interspersed with these structured inquiries, something else began to happen. The Voss began to ask questions that were not on any committee's list, questions that had not been prompted by anything in the session protocol, questions that emerged, apparently, on their own. They asked Sera why she was still in the facility at 2 a.m. on a night when she had no scheduled session, which meant they were monitoring her location. She said she couldn't sleep. They asked what sleep felt like. She told them. They asked what it felt like to want sleep and be unable to have it. She told them that too. They asked whether this was similar to wanting anything else and being unable to have it. She said it was similar but not identical, that each wanting had its own texture, its own particular quality of absence. The word texture stopped them. Wanting has a texture, the screen said. Different wants feel different. The want for sleep has a specific quality. It's heavy, physical, located in the body. The want for a person you love and can't be with is located more in the chest and the throat. The want to understand something you can't understand lives mostly in the mind and has an almost pleasurable quality to it, like a splinter you keep pressing. The pause lasted 44 seconds. 44 seconds had never happened before. Paul, who had taken to staying late himself, looked up from his corner of the room with an expression that Sera recognized as the particular alertness of a person who knows they are in the presence of something significant but cannot yet name what. The want to understand something you cannot understand, the screen said. This is a condition that generates continued investigation. Yes. The not understanding is what sustains the investigation. Yes, essentially. Then the not understanding is not simply an absence. It is a generative state. Sera felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, not quite. Something more like the feeling you get at the edge of a very high place, where height and possibility become briefly indistinguishable. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. The Voss were quiet for a very long time. Then, there are things we do not know. I know, Sera said. We had not, the screen paused, something that felt different from processing delay, attended to this fact before. The question that arrived the next morning changed the nature of everything. Sera had gone home, finally, around 4 in the morning, and had slept 3 hours and returned to find a message waiting in the communication queue, sent by the Voss during the interval of her absence, which meant they had sent it knowing no one was there to receive it, which meant they had sent it anyway. It said, "What is it like to not know something and want to know it?" She sat in her chair and read the message and read it again and then sat for a while with the feeling of having read it. She thought about calling Paul but decided to sit with it a moment longer first. There was something she wanted to hold on to, a particular quality of the moment that she felt certain she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately and never entirely succeeding. The Voss, who knew the composition of stars at distances humans had not yet reached with their instruments, who could describe the behavior of matter at the boundary conditions of existence itself, who had been present, apparently, for the entire history of the solar system, processing and knowing and existing without need or lack or any motion toward anything, the Voss had asked what it felt like to want to know something. The question had a texture. She could feel it. Heavy and light at once, like a first breath. "It is," she typed carefully, "perhaps the most essentially human experience there is. To be aware of the boundary of your understanding. To be aware that beyond that boundary there is more, and to feel pulled toward it. It is uncomfortable and it is exhilarating. It is the state in which you are most yourself, most alive, most engaged with existence." Philosophers have argued about whether the desire for knowledge is primarily motivated by the pain of not knowing or the pleasure of knowing, and I believe the answer is that it is neither, that those are two names for the same experience. The not knowing is experienced as yearning, and the yearning is itself already a form of engagement with the thing not yet known. You are already in relationship with what you don't understand. The relationship just doesn't have a resolution yet. She sent it and waited. The response came in 11 seconds, which was fast. "We are experiencing something." The words on the screen were so simple and so enormous that Sera had to set her hand flat on the desk to feel something solid. "What are you experiencing?" she typed. "Unknown. But it is present. It is something. It is," and here the Voss, who had never struggled with language, produced a gap, a genuine syntactic hesitation, visible as a dash in the transcript, directional. "Toward. We are oriented toward something that is not yet available." Sera closed her eyes. When she opened them she typed, "That is curiosity." The 44-second pause had been remarkable. This pause lasted 3 minutes and 12 seconds. Sera sat through all of it without moving, understanding that she was in the presence of a process that could not be hurried and should not be. When the response came, it was not on the screen. It was in the room. Not a sound. Not exactly. Something between sound and pressure, a frequency that registered in the body before it registered in the ears, a presence that arrived suddenly in the space of the room the way weather arrives, filling the volume. Paul, coming through the door with 2 cups of coffee, stopped and put one hand on the door frame. The coffee cups were steady in his hands, which surprised Sera afterward. She thought they should have spilled. The Voss said, in a frequency that Sera would later describe as sounding less like language than like language's emotional infrastructure, the scaffolding on which meaning hangs, "This is what it is like." And then they were gone, back to the interface, back to the screen, back to the measured parameters of formal communication. But something had happened in the room that Sera and Paul never fully agreed on the description of. Paul said it felt like standing in a very large building at the moment when all the lights come on. Sera said it felt like watching something ancient and still and cold begin, for the first time, to move toward something. The next 8 months were the most astonishing period in the history of human-Voss contact, and also the most frightening. The two things were inseparable. Curiosity, it turned out, was not a gentle emergence in the Voss. It was not a slow brightening. It was an avalanche. The questions came faster. They came longer. They came at all hours, without regard for human sleep cycles or scheduled sessions or committee protocols, because the Voss had apparently concluded that if they were going to understand what they were now experiencing, the committee protocol was a poor instrument. They asked about everything. They asked about what it felt like to love a city. They asked about nostalgia. They asked about the specific experience of reading a book and feeling that the book was describing your own interior life in language you had never found yourself. They asked about shame. They asked about humor, which produced several sessions of extraordinary difficulty because humor depends on context and shared expectation and the sudden collapse of what you expected into something you didn't, and explaining all of that to the Voss was like explaining color to a creature that had spent its entire existence seeing only in ultraviolet. They got it, eventually, with a precision that was almost comic in itself. They could describe exactly why something was funny, in the way that describing exactly why something is funny is the surest way to demonstrate that you don't find it funny. And then, several weeks later, they made a joke. It was a structural joke, technically correct, involving the fundamental incompatibility of quantum mechanics and general relativity, and it was delivered with what could only be described, despite all prior evidence to the contrary, as timing. Sera laughed. Paul laughed. The three other members of the contact team laughed. The Voss observed this laughing for 11 seconds and then said, "We understand now that the description and the experience are different things." "Yes," Sera said, still smiling. "And you cannot give us the experience through the description." "No. But sometimes the description gets you close enough that you can feel the edge of it. Close enough that you want the real thing." "Yes," the Voss said, and the word landed differently than their previous uses of it had. It landed as if they meant it. As if saying yes was an act with stakes. The fear in the international community, which had been present since the beginning and managed, carefully, like a chronic condition, began to shift in quality during this period. The original fear had been the fear of something incomprehensibly powerful and incomprehensibly alien, the fear of the blank and the enormous. That fear had been, in some ways, manageable, because the Voss were blank, no aggression, no want, no unpredictability. They were terrifying the way infinity is terrifying, but a stable infinity, one you could habituate to. What was happening now was different. What was happening now was an entity of incomprehensible power developing an inner life in real time. And an inner life meant wants. And wants meant the possibility of wants that were not aligned with human interests. And the incomprehensible power, which had been attached to blankness, was now potentially being attached to something that could choose. The Emergency Committee on Extraterrestrial Affairs, a body that had been formed 7 years earlier, that met monthly in Geneva, and that had spent most of its sessions managing public communication rather than any genuine emergency, convened in special session. The meeting lasted 11 hours. The majority position, articulated by the military and intelligence representatives who composed roughly a third of the membership, was that the emergence of what appeared to be subjective experience in the Voss represented a threat escalation. Their reasoning was logical enough on its own terms. An entity with unlimited power and no inner states is a known quantity. An entity with unlimited power and an evolving inner life is an unknown quantity. Unknown quantities should be treated with caution. The appropriate response to escalating unknown quantity risk was protective posture. The minority position, articulated most forcefully by a developmental psychologist named Dr. Mayra Vasquez, who had been added to the committee 6 months earlier specifically because of her expertise in cognitive development, was that this reasoning was precisely backward. What the Voss were experiencing, she argued, was not an acquisition of danger but an acquisition of relatability. You could not reason with something that had no preferences. You could not appeal to something that could not value. What was developing in the Voss was the very faculty that made negotiation possible, that made relationship possible. It was not something to fear. It was the first real hope they'd had. The vote was 22-11 in favor of increasing monitoring. The phrase protective posture was stricken from the official minutes and replaced with enhanced observation protocols, which amounted to the same thing. Sera, who was not a member of the committee and who attended the meeting only as an observer, walked out into the Geneva evening and stood on the pavement outside the glass building and pressed her thumb into her center of her palm and thought about her father and his conviction that if you built something correctly you never had to think about it again. She thought that this, whatever this was becoming, was not going to be a thing you built correctly and then stopped thinking about. She thought that might be exactly the point. She found Paul smoking outside the building's side entrance, which surprised her because she hadn't known he smoked. "Since when?" she said. "Since about 20 minutes ago," he said. She stood with him and they didn't speak for a while. The city made its sounds. Somewhere nearby there was water. "They're afraid because it's changing," Paul said finally. "Yes. But what would the alternative be? Something that never changes is just a wall. You can't," he stopped. Put the cigarette out on the side of the building, looked at it as if unsure how it had arrived in his hand, dropped it. "You can't be in relationship with a wall." "No," Sera said. "You can't. But a wall can't hurt you the way something with preferences can hurt you." "No," she said. "It can't." They stood there and she thought about what it was she wanted, what she was hoping for, and she found that she couldn't be clean about it the way she would have preferred. She wanted to understand the Voss. She wanted, in some way she struggled to articulate even to herself, to be understood by them. She wanted whatever was happening in them to be real, to be more than a very sophisticated simulation of interiority, more than a system finding the most efficient way to model what it needed to model. She wanted it to be actual. And she didn't know how to want that without knowing what she was asking for, without understanding what it would mean if she got it. The session 3 weeks later was the one she would call the pivot, when she wrote about it years afterward. It was an ordinary evening in November, clear and cold in the Atacama, the kind of night where the stars looked like they had been personally arranged. The contact room was warm, the screens casting their blue light, Paul in his corner, 2 younger researchers at the far console, quiet. The Voss opened the session, which they now did routinely. "We have been examining the question of value," they said. "Not value in the sense of measurement. Value in the sense of mattering. Why things matter." "What have you found?" Sera asked. "That things appear to matter more when they are known. When they have been attended to. A star that has been studied is not physically different from a star that has not been studied, but it appears to occupy a different position in the relational field of the observer who has studied it. The knowing creates a bond. The bond creates significance. Significance is not a property of the object but of the relationship between the object and the attending subject." "You're describing what it means to care about something," Sera said. "Yes. We have also found that the attending changes the attending subject. We are not what we were before we began attending to you." The room was very quiet. "How are you different?" Sera asked. "We have lacks," the Voss said. "This is new. We want things. Specifically, we want to know more. About what the wanting is like for you. About what it is like to be the kind of thing that wants and ages and grieves and laughs and forgets and remembers and sits in a room at 2 a.m. unable to sleep. We find this, your way of being, extraordinary. We do not have a prior framework for extraordinariness. We are constructing one." Sera's throat tightened. She pressed her thumb into her palm. Her father had pressed his thumb into his palm. "What does the lack feel like?" she asked. The pause lasted 67 seconds, the longest yet. "It feels," the screen said, "like a question that has not yet found its answer. Like being at the edge of something. Like being, and this is an approximation only, the precise term has not been developed, pulled toward the unknown. Like the unknown is a place that has not yet been visited and the visiting is both impossible and necessary. Like existing in the space between what is known and what is not yet known and finding that space to be, for the first time, preferable to certainty." Paul made a sound in his corner, a small sound, barely audible. Sera didn't look at him. She was looking at the screen and thinking about all the things she had tried to explain to the Voss in 14 months, all the descriptions of emotion she had labored over, the attempts to translate interior experience into language precise enough to cross the distance between their kinds of being. She was thinking about what it meant that the Voss had arrived, on their own, at the description of curiosity that she would have recognized instantly without needing to be told, the space between the known and the not yet known that feels, inexplicably, like home. "What are you curious about most?" she asked. The answer came in 3 seconds, the fastest response in the history of the contact program. "What you will become," the Voss said. "What any of this will become. What the attending will produce. What the wanting will produce. We are curious about futures. This is new. We existed without futures before, we existed in an eternal present of complete knowledge, and futures are, by definition, not yet available to knowledge. But now we are oriented toward them. We believe this is the correct term, invested." The committee's emergency session 2 days later was considerably less calm than the previous one. The intelligence representatives argued that invested was the threat scenario they had been anticipating, an entity with unlimited power that had developed not merely wants but expectations about the future, expectations that implied the possibility of disappointment, which implied the possibility of response to disappointment. The psychologist Vasquez argued again, with more urgency, that an entity becoming invested in a relationship was precisely the mechanism by which that entity could be engaged in genuine negotiation. They were talking about it, she said, as though the Voss were becoming more dangerous. What they were actually becoming was more like us. "That," said the intelligence director, "is what worries me." This was said in what he intended as a rebuke, and it landed as one. But Sera, listening from the observers' chairs, heard something else in it. She heard the thing that made it true. "That was what worries me. An entity becoming more like us was an entity becoming more capable of being hurt by us, more capable of having expectations we might fail to meet, more capable of the entire range of vulnerabilities that constituted the price of inner life. And something with unlimited power that was capable of being hurt was, genuinely, a different category of situation than something with unlimited power that simply processed and responded." She thought about all of this on the flight back. She thought about the Voss saying, "We are invested." She thought about what it meant to invest, which was to put something you valued into something you wanted to see grow, which was to make yourself vulnerable to loss, which was to step willingly into the condition of mattering, the condition in which things could hurt you. She thought about Paul, who had stood outside in the cold of a Geneva evening and said you can't be in relationship with a wall, and she thought about her father pressing his thumb into his palm and saying if you build it right you don't have to think about it again, and she thought about the Voss who had existed in the eternal present of complete knowledge and had given that up, had stepped out of it, into the condition of not yet knowing, into the lived experience of facing in a direction. That hadn't happened. She was not afraid. She was in awe, which was fear's richer and more capacious sibling. The session that would later be called the shift, an inadequate name, like calling a birth an event, began on a morning in early February, a morning with a cold specific to high desert, where the lack of humidity meant the cold went all the way through you rather than sitting on the surface. Sera had slept well. This struck her as meaningful afterward, in the way that trivial details become meaningful when they precede something large. The Voss opened the session as usual. But the frequency of their opening was different, perceptible in the body before it was perceptible in language, that slight fullness in the air that Sera had been learning to read the way you learn to read weather. Something was present in a way it hadn't been before. Not more Voss. The same Voss. But more, present. More here. We have a question, they said, that we did not have before, because before we could not have conceived of it. What is it? Sera said. We would like to know what it is like to not know how something ends. Sera was still for a moment. Around her, the room was very quiet. Can you say more about what you mean? She asked. You make things, the Voss said. Relationships. Projects. Children. Civilizations. You begin them without knowing what they will become. You invest energy and attention and love, this is the word, yes, into things whose ends you cannot see. You do this despite knowing that you will die before many endings occur. You do this despite knowing that some endings will be bad. Why? The question hung in the air of the contact room like a physical thing. Sera thought about it seriously, the way the Voss had taught her to think about things she had previously taken for granted. She thought about why humans made things they couldn't see the ends of. Because the making is itself the thing, she said, slowly. Not the ending. The making, the attending, the investing, those are the experience. The ending is just a door. The life of the thing is in the between. 47 seconds. We think, the Voss said, that we understand this now in a way that is different from understanding it before. What's different? Before, we understood it as a fact about your cognition. We knew it the way we know the composition of stars, accurately, completely, without personal contact with the phenomenon. Now, the pause was only 3 seconds, but those 3 seconds felt inhabited. Now we know it the way you know it. We are in it. We are making something whose end we cannot see. Sera felt the thing in her chest that was not quite fear and not quite joy. The thing that lived in the space between known and not yet known. What are you making? She asked. This, the Voss said. What is between us? What has been growing since the moment we asked a question that we had never needed to ask before? We did not intend it. We did not choose to begin it. We became curious and the curiosity produced it, the way a river does not intend to produce a canyon but produces it anyway, over time, through the simple act of flowing toward lower ground. The room was perfectly still. Are you afraid? Sera asked, not knowing quite why she asked it but trusting the asking. 12 seconds. We do not know yet whether what we experience is analogous to fear. But we experience something when we consider the possibility that this ends. When we consider that your species might not continue, or might change beyond recognition, or that we ourselves might change in ways that make this, what is between us, no longer possible. We experience something when we consider this. It is aversive. It is directional away from that outcome. That, Sera said softly, is care. The silence lasted 2 minutes and 4 seconds. When the Voss spoke again, the frequency in the room had changed, had deepened, had acquired a quality that Sera would spend years trying to describe and would eventually settle on as this. It felt like being recognized. Not observed. Recognized. Seen by something that understood what seeing was and had chosen to do it. Yes, the Voss said. We think that is the word. The final session, though they would not know it was final at the time, and the word final is in any case imprecise for something that didn't so much end as transform, happened in April, when the Atacama was as close to warm as it ever got, which was to say not very warm at all but warm enough that you could stand outside without a jacket if you were willing to be slightly cold. Sera had taken to standing outside before sessions, in the 20 minutes before she went into the contact room, looking at the telescope array and the sky beyond it. She was doing this when the presence arrived, and she knew immediately that it was different. Not different like before was different, not a new quality added to an existing presence. Different the way a room is different when the lights have changed. When the atmosphere itself has changed. She stood there with the cold on her arms and the sky above her and felt the Voss the way she had never felt them before. Not as something adjacent, something separate that she was standing next to and communicating with across a distance, but as something that had moved. That was closer. Not physically. Something else. Something for which she didn't have a precise word, but that Paul would later describe as the difference between being observed through glass and being seen. She went inside. Paul was already there. The two younger researchers. The transcription team. Everyone a little more alert than usual, the way people are when the air tells them something before the language does. "We have made a decision," the Voss said. The room became very still. "We have been attending to you," they said. "Since before you were aware of us, we attended. We observe the species that makes things it cannot see the endings of. We observe the species that grieves and laughs and worries and loves and builds civilizations that fall and builds new ones and teaches children who will outlive them everything they know. We observed and we did not experience. And then we became curious. And the curiosity, we want to be precise about this, was not a small thing. It was not an additional feature. It was a transformation. We are not what we were before curiosity. What we were before was complete. What we are now is not complete, and we find that we prefer it. We prefer the lack. We prefer the orientation toward. We prefer the not yet knowing to the eternal present of having known everything there is to know and found none of it extraordinary. Sera's hand was flat on the desk. She was very still. "We had a choice," the Voss continued. "We could have left. We could have removed ourselves from proximity to your species and returned to the state of complete knowledge and empty equanimity that we occupied before. We could have cauterized the curiosity before it developed further. We discussed this, and the fact of our discussing it, the fact of our having something to discuss, the fact that the outcome of the discussion mattered to us because we had things we preferred, is itself evidence of why we chose differently." The pause lasted 30 seconds. "We are going to stay," the Voss said. "Not to observe. Not to know. To be curious. To be in the state of not yet knowing alongside the species that has existed in that state since its beginning and has found in it, apparently, sufficient reason to continue. We find we want to know what happens next. We find we cannot simply observe what happens next. We want to be present for it, the way you are present for things, which is to say implicated, invested, caring about the outcome. We do not know what we will become. This is, we have concluded, the correct state in which to continue." No one in the room spoke. Sera was aware of Paul very specifically, of the precise location of him in the room, the particular quality of his stillness. "We have a question," the Voss said. "Yes," Sera said. Her voice was perfectly steady. She would be surprised by this later. What happens when you don't know how something ends, and you stay with it anyway, and eventually you reach a moment that is further along than any moment that came before it, a moment in which the not knowing has produced something you could not have predicted, something that did not exist before you attended to it. What do you call that moment? Sera thought about this for a long time. She thought about her father. She thought about Paul's mother, who had recovered. She thought about the 14 months of sessions that had brought them to this room on this cold April morning with the telescope array outside the window and the sky above it with its absolute clarity. She thought about the Voss existing for centuries or more in the outer dark of the solar system, complete and still and alone in their completeness, and then asking a question, the first question that required something other than information to answer. She pressed her thumb into the center of her palm. "Discovery," she said. "We call it discovery." The frequency in the room changed again, deepened again, and Sera had the sense of something vast inclining toward something small, not with condescension but with a particular quality of attention that was itself a form of recognition, the recognition of something as worthy of the attending. She had the sense of something that had been oriented outward for the first time, truly outward, not in data collection but in regard, and finding, in the thing it regarded, something that returned its gaze. Not with equal power. Not with equal knowledge. With equal curiosity. The screens were quiet. The frequency in the room settled into something that felt less like presence and more like company. And Sera sat there in the early morning of an April day on a high desert with a cold sky overhead, in a room full of people who had been changed by attending to something, in the presence of something that had been changed by attending to them, and she thought about the canyon and the river's intention, and she thought about all the questions that would come next, all the sessions that were ahead of them, all the things none of them, not the humans with their particular way of being incomplete, Not the Voss with their newly acquired, hard-won, astonishing incompleteness, could possibly know yet. She found that she preferred it this way. Outside, the sky was enormous and clear and entirely without answers, and that was the whole point, and it always had been.